I am Sergeant Tilly Taylor, 32 years old, a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne. I am standing before two small white caskets that hold my infant sons. In the suffocating silence of the Fort Liberty Chapel, my mother-in-law, Evelyn, whispers to the people around her, just loud enough for me to hear. She is turning me into the murderer in the tragedy of my own life. No one knew the truth. Not until my 4-year-old daughter, Lily, tugged on the sleeve of my dress uniform and said something that lit the fuse. What she said next changed everything. If you have ever been made to feel like the crazy one by the very people who were supposed to protect you, just to cover up a devastating truth, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and follow along. My story doesn't begin with this tragedy. It begins with the promise of a family, a promise that became a deadly trap. The fabric of my Army service uniform, my dress blues, was the only thing holding me upright. It was a cage of perfectly pressed dark blue wool and starched white cotton, and inside it, my skeleton had forgotten how to stand on its own. The seams dug into my skin, a constant grounding pressure against the formless, floating horror of the moment. I registered the sensation clinically, the way a soldier assesses their gear before a jump. Stiff, secure, functional. I wasn't listening to the chaplain's words. I saw his mouth move, saw the gentle, practiced sympathy in his eyes, but the sound was replaced by a low hum inside my own head. My focus was absolute, narrowed down to two objects at the front of the chapel, the caskets of my sons, Ethan and Elijah. They were so white they seemed to absorb the light from the stained glass windows. But more than their color, it was their size that felt like a physical blow. They were absurdly, impossibly small. The sight of them defied all logic, a statistical error in the universe that my mind refused to compute. 6 feet to my left, but a universe away, sat my husband, Noah. He wasn't looking at the caskets. He wasn't looking at me. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped, and he was entirely lost in a world I couldn't reach. A world, I knew, that was governed by his mother. His silence was a presence of its own in the room, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was a more brutal accusation than any word Evelyn could ever speak, because it came from the one person sworn to be my ally. And Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was giving the performance of a lifetime. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black dress, a single strand of pearls at her throat, she was the very picture of the grieving Southern matriarch. She moved through the pews with a tragic, fragile grace, dabbing a lace handkerchief at her dry, watchful eyes. I saw her approach my commanding officer, Colonel Miller. She laid a delicate hand on his arm, her voice a sweet, heartbroken whisper that carried in the chapel's acoustics. "She always put her career first, Colonel," she murmured, shaking her head with a profound, performative sorrow. I begged her to slow down. For the babies. Each word was a perfectly aimed projectile, designed to shatter my reputation. To a young Army wife sitting behind me, her approach was different, more intimate, a woman-to-woman confidence. "Postpartum depression is such a terrifying thing," Evelyn whispered, her voice laced with feigned concern. "I tried to help, you know. I offered to stay over, to take the night feedings, but she pushed everyone away." She was planting seeds of doubt in the very community that was my bedrock. She was painting a picture of me as a cold, career-obsessed soldier, an unstable mother cracking under pressure. She was rewriting history in real time, and I was just a statue in a uniform, forced to watch her do it. I stood there, paralyzed, as my honor. The one thing a soldier has that can never be taken, only surrendered, was being systematically dismantled. Then came the moment that solidified my isolation. A fellow sergeant, a tough-as-nails paratrooper named Diaz, who had jumped into more hostile territory than I could count, walked over and placed a firm, comforting hand on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture of solidarity, a silent message. "I see you. I'm with you." I felt a flicker of warmth, the first thing I had felt all day. But I saw Noah, out of the corner of my eye, refused to even lift his head. He didn't acknowledge Diaz. He didn't acknowledge me. He just sat there, a hollow man in a suit. Evelyn saw it too. Like a predator sensing a weakness, she was at his side in an instant. She didn't look at me. She gently took Noah's arm, her touch both soft and controlling. "Come on, sweetie," she cooed, as if speaking to a child. "Let's go say hello to Mr. Henderson from your office." And just like that, he stood up, obedient. He allowed himself to be led away, leaving me standing utterly alone with Diaz's hand still on my shoulder. The warmth vanished, replaced by an arctic chill that sank deep into my bones. It was in that precise, crystalline moment of abandonment that the truth finally broke through my shock-induced numbness. I wasn't in a fight with my mother-in-law. I was in a war. And my husband wasn't my ally. He was occupied territory. The service droned on. People came and went, their faces a blur of pity. And now, thanks to Evelyn, suspicion. Finally, the honor guard began the flag-folding ceremony. 13 precise, symbolic folds. The sharp snap of the fabric echoed in the silent chapel. The colonel presented the perfectly folded triangle of stars and stripes to me. "On behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I accepted it, my hands steady, my face a mask of military discipline. This was a ritual I understood. This was order amidst the chaos. But as the ceremony concluded, just as I felt I might completely disintegrate, a small pressure asserted itself on my hand. I looked down. My 4-year-old daughter, Lily, who had been preternaturally quiet the entire time, was looking up at me. Her little fingers squeezed mine. In her wide, clear blue eyes, there was no confusion, no fear. There was only a fierce, unwavering certainty. It was a simple, childish gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through my frozen limbs. It was a silent promise, a coded message in the darkness. "The truth is still here, Mommy. I have it." In the face of all the lies, the whispers, and the devastating betrayal, I clung to that single, undeniable truth, the love of my daughter. As I held her hand, the cloying scent of the funeral lilies in the chapel suddenly seemed to change, to sweeten, to thicken into something else. The image of Evelyn's perfectly composed, grieving face blurred and dissolved, replaced by another memory, another face, another smile from what felt like a lifetime ago. A welcoming smile, just as sweet, just as perfect, and just as false. That smile. The one I saw in the chapel, stretched across Evelyn's face like a mask of grief. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it. Years ago, that same smile had promised me everything I'd ever wanted. A world away from the sterile silence of the funeral home. It had promised me a family. Before Noah, my life had been a series of temporary addresses, a collection of bedrooms in other people's houses. Growing up in the North Carolina foster care system teaches you to be self-reliant. It teaches you to be strong. But it never teaches you what it feels like to belong. The Army gave me a purpose and a uniform, a brotherhood of sorts, but it was still a life packed in a duffel bag, always ready for the next deployment, the next move. Then I met Noah Richardson at an off-base fundraiser. He wasn't a soldier. He was a civil engineer who spoke with a quiet passion about blueprints and load-bearing walls, about building things that were meant to last. He talked about foundations, about structures that could withstand a storm. To a woman whose entire life felt transient, his words were a language of permanence I desperately wanted to learn. What truly captured me were his stories about home. He described a sprawling, noisy family of Sunday dinners where roast chicken filled a generational home. He spoke of holidays with cousins swarming the yard and a mother who was the center of their universe. He painted a picture. And I, a girl who ate most meals under the hum of fluorescent lights in a group home, fell in love with the canvas. I fell in love with the idea of being part of that picture, of finally having roots so deep they could never be pulled up again. I didn't just fall for the man, I fell for his entire world. My first visit to that world was a drive into Haymount, the old money heart of Fayetteville. Grand brick houses sat under ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. A neighborhood that whispered of history. Evelyn Richardson's house was the grandest of them all. She met me at the door, her smile as bright and flawless as the pearls she wore. Tilly, we are so thrilled to finally meet you, honey, she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled of Chanel number 5. I made a pound cake, just for you. It's my mother's recipe. Inside, the house was immaculate with dark wood and polished silver. The pound cake sat on the table, a perfect golden ring on a crystal platter, straight from a magazine. For a moment, I let myself believe this could be my life. This warmth, this elegance, this belonging. Then, as she served the cake, the real welcome began. "So, the 82nd Airborne," she said, her voice dripping with sweet admiration. "That must be so difficult, all that jumping out of planes." She paused, placing a delicate slice on Noah's plate. "My Noah, he needs a lot of looking after. He's always been sensitive. A wife really ought to be at home, to tend to the hearth." The words were wrapped in the prettiest southern drawl, but the message inside was hard and bitter. My career wasn't an accomplishment, it was an obstacle. My strength wasn't an asset, it was a threat to her son's comfort. The buttery pound cake suddenly tasted like ash. I looked at Noah, expecting him to defend me. He just smiled, forked a large piece of cake into his mouth, and said, "Mom's the best baker in Fayetteville." The red flags were there, waving in plain sight, but I was colorblind with hope. A few months later, after we were engaged, the subtle campaign of colonization began. My apartment was a small 2-bedroom near the base. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every piece earned, my sanctuary. I made the mistake of showing it to Evelyn. A week later, I returned from a 3-day field exercise, exhausted and grimy, to find her car in the driveway. I walked in to find Evelyn and Noah in my kitchen, surrounded by boxes. My pots and pans were stacked, my utensil drawer empty. "We're just helping you get organized, sweetie," Evelyn chirped, wiping her hands on an apron she'd brought. She pointed to new shelves on the wall. "See? A much more efficient use of space. It'll make cooking for Noah so much easier for you." My entire kitchen had been rearranged. Her system had replaced mine. I felt a hot surge of anger, a feeling of being violated. "Evelyn," I started, trying to keep my voice even. "I liked the way it was. This is my kitchen." Noah immediately stepped in, putting an arm around my shoulder, playing the peacemaker. "Hey, take it easy," he said softly, his voice meant to soothe. "Mom was just trying to help. You're overreacting." "You're overreacting." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. It was the first time my reality had been flatly denied by the man I loved. My feelings weren't valid, they were an overreaction. My personal space wasn't sacred, it was subject to his mother's approval. In that moment, watching him stand beside her, a united front against me in my own home, the first deep crack appeared in the foundation I thought we were building. My throat tightened. I, a paratrooper trained to command respect, had been dismissed like a hysterical child. And I let it happen. I swallowed my anger and said nothing more. My best friend in the unit, Maria, saw right through it. We were cleaning our rifles in the armory a few days later when I told her what happened. She stopped, looked me dead in the eye, her expression hard. "She's training you, Taylor," she said, her voice low and serious. "That's a classic psychological warfare tactic. Invade and occupy. She's teaching you how to surrender without a fight. Don't you dare let her win." I laughed it off. I told her she was being too dramatic, that she didn't understand Southern mothers. But her words stuck with me, a cold little knot in my stomach. I ignored them. I chose to believe in the dream, in the Sunday dinners and the family photos on the wall. I believed my love for Noah was strong enough to build a bridge over any troubled water. I was a fool. I wasn't building a bridge. I was marching willingly into a guerrilla war in a hostile territory with no training, no allies, and no understanding of the enemy. Ignoring Maria's warning was the biggest tactical error of my life. I had walked into my marriage believing it would be a sanctuary, a fortified position against the world. Instead, it became a territory under constant low-grade siege, and the invading force wore my mother-in-law's smiling face. My life fell into a predictable, soul-crushing rhythm. I'd leave for a few days of field training, sleeping in the dirt, running miles with a full pack, feeling competent and in control. And I would return to a home that had been subtly Evelynized. New floral curtains in the living room. The couch angled differently. A framed picture of Noah as a child suddenly appearing on the mantelpiece. She was always there when I got back. A pitcher of sweet tea on the counter and a deceptively warm smile on her face. "I just came by to make sure Noah was all right while you were gone, dear," she'd say, never admitting she was occupying my space, always positioning herself as the selfless helper. The insidious part was how Noah enabled it. He'd wrap an arm around me, kiss my forehead, and say, "It's so great having Mom here when you're away. I don't get lonely." He meant it as a compliment to her, but it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Each time he said it, the unspoken message was clear. My presence was not essential. My absence was an inconvenience easily filled by his mother. When I found out I was pregnant with Lily, Evelyn's quiet incursions escalated into a full-scale invasion. "A soldier can't possibly raise a baby all on her own," she announced to the family during one of those Sunday dinners I once dreamed of. "I'll find a place closer by, to help out." It wasn't an offer, it was a declaration of intent. And she did, moving into a condo just 10 minutes away. The day we brought Lily home from Womack Army Medical Center, Evelyn was already there, waiting. She had effectively taken command of my home. And from that moment on, she began a relentless campaign to strip me of my role as a mother. She criticized the way I breastfed. "Are you sure she's getting enough? She seems fussy." She hovered over me when I changed a diaper. "You need to be more careful around her navel, Tilly." She used my identity as a soldier, the very thing I was proud of, as a weapon against me. "The way you soothe her is as rigid as training a recruit," she'd say with a condescending little laugh. Or, "Let me, dear. You're used to giving orders, not being gentle." The breaking point, the moment that burned itself into my memory, came on a sweltering North Carolina night. Lily was only a few weeks old, colicky and crying inconsolably. I had been walking her, rocking her, singing to her for hours. I was exhausted, my uniform from the day still on, my hair a mess, my body aching. But she was my daughter, and I would have walked to the ends of the earth for her. Finally, her cries began to soften into whimpers. I was humming a lullaby, my cheek pressed against her warm, downy head, feeling that primal connection, that fierce, all-consuming love. Suddenly, my bedroom door opened. Evelyn stood there, hands on her hips, her face a mask of disapproval. "You don't know how to be a mother," she said, her voice cold and sharp. Before I could even process the words, she strode over, plucked Lily from my arms, and cradled her expertly. "Let me," she commanded. "You go rest." My arms felt empty, cold. I looked past her, my eyes pleading with my husband, who was standing right behind her in the doorway. I was waiting for him to step in, to defend me, to tell his mother she had crossed a line that should never be crossed. And Noah? He just nodded. If you've ever had a mother-in-law, or even your own mother, she had engineered a perfect no-win scenario. If I didn't eat her food, I was a bad mother neglecting my child's nutrition. If I did eat it, I was a slob who no longer cared about her appearance. Every meal became a test, another opportunity for me to fail. The final thread of my hope snapped one evening after a particularly grueling week. Lily was asleep. Evelyn had finally gone home. The house was quiet. I found Noah in the living room, reading a book. The dam of my exhaustion and suppressed rage finally broke. Tears streamed down my face as I sank onto the floor in front of him. "I can't do this anymore, Noah," I choked out, the words raw and desperate. "I can't. Your mother is taking everything from me. She's taking our daughter." He put his book down and knelt in front of me, pulling me into an embrace. For a fleeting second, I felt a surge of hope. He held me, stroked my hair. But then he spoke, and his words extinguished that hope forever. "You're just tired, honey," he said, his voice calm and patronizing. "You know how stressful your job is. You're not used to asking for help. Mom is just trying to carry some of the load for you. Honestly, Tilly, you should be grateful to her." Grateful? He wanted me to be grateful. In that moment, looking into the eyes of the man I'd promised my life to, I finally understood. I didn't have a husband. I had my mother-in-law's oldest son living in my house, and in their war, I was the enemy. How do you continue a war when your only ally has already surrendered? For months after that night, I operated on a kind of numb autopilot. I performed my duties at the base, I cared for Lily, I coexisted with the man who shared my bed but not my reality. A fragile, bitter truce settled over our home. Then I found out I was pregnant. With twins. For a single fleeting moment, the news felt like a miracle. A chance to reset, a reason for Noah to finally step up and become a true partner. A father who would protect his new family. It was a foolish, desperate hope. When we told Evelyn, her face wasn't one of joy. I watched her eyes, trained as a soldier to read micro-expressions, and I saw something else entirely. The cold, calculating glimmer of a strategist who had just been handed the perfect opportunity. "Oh my lord," she gasped, clutching Noah's hand dramatically. "Twins! Tilly, you poor thing. A soldier can't possibly manage 2 newborns and a toddler. I'm moving in." It wasn't a question. Noah didn't look at me. He didn't ask what I wanted. He just turned to me, his face a mixture of relief and resolve, and delivered the verdict. "It's the best thing for all of us," he said. The walls I felt closing in before now seemed to solidify into a prison cell. I was no longer just a soldier in a hostile territory. I was a prisoner of war in my own home. Ethan and Elijah were born 6 weeks premature, tiny and fragile, their skin almost translucent. They were fighters, the doctors said. But they needed quiet, rest. Evelyn used their fragility to seize complete control. She took over the night feedings. "You need to rest and recover, Tilly," she'd insist, shooing me out of the nursery. "A soldier's body needs to heal properly." But my soldier's body and my mother's intuition knew something was wrong. A deep, primal alarm bell was ringing incessantly in my gut. The boys weren't just resting, they were unnaturally still. They slept with a terrifying lethargy, a profound quietness that felt less like peace and more like absence. They rarely cried for food, their little bodies were limp, and they weren't gaining weight. I knew, with the certainty of a paratrooper checking their static line, that this was not normal. I tried to tell Noah. I cornered him in the kitchen one night, my voice a low, urgent whisper. "They're sleeping too much, Noah. It's not right." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just kept stirring his coffee, shrugging. "They're preemies, Tilly. Preemies sleep a lot. You're just being an over-anxious mom." He dismissed my concerns the same way he dismissed everything else. My training, my instincts, my reality. None of it mattered. The horrifying truth came from the one person whose world was still simple enough to be honest. One afternoon, I was sitting on the floor with Lily, reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar. We got to the page with all the food the caterpillar eats on Saturday. Lily pointed a chubby finger at the illustration of the sugar shaker. "Grandma has sugar powder like that, Mommy," she said matter-of-factly. My blood ran cold. I forced myself to keep my voice light, playful. "Oh yeah? What does Grandma do with her sugar powder, sweetie?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lily looked up at me, her big blue eyes wide and innocent. "She puts it in Ethan and Elijah's milk," she said. "She says it's her special angel dust. She says it helps them sleep like little angels so they don't bother Daddy." Angel dust. The 2 words shattered my world. Every cell in my body went into high alert. I scooped Lily up, my movements jerky, and marched out into the living room where Evelyn was knitting and Noah was reading the paper. The domestic tranquility of the scene was grotesque. "What have you been putting in their bottles?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it would split me in two. Evelyn's performance was instantaneous and flawless. Her eyes welled with tears, her hand flew to her chest as if I had physically struck her. "My goodness, Tilly, what are you talking about?" she cried, her voice trembling. She turned to Noah, her face a perfect portrait of a wounded victim. "Noah, do you hear her? The poor thing is having delusions. It's the postpartum stress." I held up Lily. "Our daughter just told me. She told me you've been putting your sleeping pills in their milk." Noah stared, not at his mother, but at me. and in his eyes I saw no concern for our sons. I saw only pity and fear. Fear of me. He stood up slowly, as if approaching a wild, unpredictable animal. "Tilly," he said, his voice laced with that same patronizing calm that had destroyed me before. "You need to put Lily down. You're not well. You need to see a doctor." He called me crazy. At the exact moment I was trying to save our children's lives from his own mother, he stood there and called me insane. That was it. That was the moment every last shred of hope I had for us, for our family, disintegrated into nothing. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. My mind screamed, a silent, primal roar of a mother watching her cubs being dragged away. But on the outside, I just froze. That night, Evelyn insisted on taking the boys again. "They need a calm environment," she said, looking pointedly at me. Noah agreed. He helped her. He carried their bassinets into the guest room where she was staying. He kissed their foreheads, then closed the door, shutting me out. He left them with her. I sat on our bed all night, fully dressed, staring at the closed door of the nursery across the hall. I didn't move. I just listened to the silence, a silence that grew heavier and more absolute with every passing hour. The next morning, they never woke up. The silence in the Fort Liberty Chapel was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on my shoulders, heavier than any rucksack. I was a statue in my dress blues again, but this time, the numbness felt different. It wasn't the hollow shock of Chapter 1. It was the dense, cold vacuum left behind by a black hole that had consumed my entire world. The two small white caskets were back in the same spot, but today they represented not just a tragedy, but a crime. My crime, according to the whispers that now followed me everywhere. Evelyn, the architect of my ruin, was preparing for her final performance. She ascended to the pulpit, a grieving grandmother in her finest black dress, clutching a lace handkerchief. The spotlight was hers, and she played her part with masterful precision. She began by sharing saccharine memories of Ethan and Elijah, memories she'd invented, painting herself as the doting, heartbroken matriarch. Then the poison began to seep out. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the crowd of uniformed soldiers and their families before landing on me. Her expression was one of profound, theatrical pity. "We cannot pretend to understand God's will," she said, her voice breaking beautifully. "But sometimes, I believe He takes His most fragile angels home to grant them peace." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Peace from a life that might have been filled with too much pressure, too much instability. A wave of murmurs rippled through the chapel. I could feel the shift. The looks of sympathy that had been thrown my way were now curdling into suspicion. Pity was being replaced by judgment. Evelyn was at the height of her power, standing on holy ground, using God as a character witness for her lies. She was winning. And in that moment, something shifted beside me. A small, warm pressure left my hand. I looked down. Lily had let go. She wasn't running. She was walking. Her small black patent leather shoes made no sound on the thick burgundy carpet as she moved with a purpose that defied her 4 years of age. She walked past Noah, who didn't even notice, his face buried in his hands. She walked past the front pew, right up to the side of the pulpit where the army chaplain stood. The entire chapel went still, watching the tiny girl in the black dress. She tugged gently on the sleeve of the chaplain's uniform. He, a kind man with a weathered face, looked down, startled, then knelt beside her, his expression softening. He leaned in, thinking she wanted to whisper something. But Lily didn't whisper. She looked past him, at the small black microphone on the lectern, the one her grandmother had just used to condemn her mother. With a clarity that cut through the suffocating silence, her child's voice rang out, pure and true and utterly devastating. Grandma put the white powder in the baby's milk. 9 words. They didn't explode. They simply hung in the air, crystalline and sharp, each syllable a shard of glass. No one moved. No one breathed. Time itself seemed to stop, frozen by the terrible, simple power of the truth. Noah's head snapped up, his face a canvas of stunned disbelief. He stared at his daughter, then whipped his head around to look at his mother. Evelyn's face, which seconds before had been a masterpiece of feigned grief, shattered. The mask disintegrated, revealing the raw, ugly panic beneath. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, no sound coming out. What? What is she saying? She finally stammered, her voice a shrill squawk. She's just a child. She's in shock. She doesn't know what she's saying. But it was too late. The lie was broken. Across the aisle, my commanding officer, Colonel Miller, a man who had spent 30 years reading people in life and death situations, rose to his feet. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He simply stood, his eyes as cold and hard as steel, fixed on Evelyn. He gave a short, sharp nod to the two military policemen, the MPs, standing guard at the chapel doors. The spell was broken. For the first time since my sons had died, the eyes that turned to me were not filled with suspicion or pity. They were filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. In that instant, surrounded by my brothers and sisters in arms, I was no longer alone. I was a soldier, and my unit was finally seeing the enemy. If you have ever waited for a moment of justice, that one single moment where the truth finally cuts through the lies, show your support with a like and comment the word justice below. Let them hear it. The two MPs began to walk down the center aisle, their footsteps measured, professional, and unstoppable. Evelyn saw them coming, and her composure completely dissolved. "No!" she shrieked, her voice turning wild and ugly. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to. Noah, tell them I didn't mean to." Noah was paralyzed, a statue of stone, his face slack with the horror of a man whose entire world had just been proven to be a lie. He just stared, frozen, as his mother, the woman he had defended over his wife, over his children, was approached by the law. He turned his gaze to me then, his eyes wide with a desperate, dawning agony. It was a silent plea for forgiveness, for understanding, for a way back. But I didn't look at him. My eyes, my entire being, were focused on only one person. I moved from my seat, walking past the chaos as if it were a distant storm. I knelt on the carpet in front of my daughter, my brave, tiny, fierce little girl. She looked at me, her expression unwavering, and in her eyes I saw the reflection of my own strength, a strength I thought I had lost. I wrapped my arms around her small, warm body, pulling her tight against my chest. And there, amidst the wreckage of my life, holding the one pure, true thing I had left, I finally allowed myself to cry. The tears I shed in the chapel, holding my daughter, were the last I allowed myself. The emotional chaos of Evelyn's arrest was immediately replaced by the cold, efficient machinery of military justice. My grief was packed away, locked in a footlocker in the back of my mind. My training took over. I was no longer just a mother. I was the primary witness in a murder investigation. The days that followed were a blur of sterile, official rooms. My home was no longer my own. It was a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, meticulously processed by investigators from both the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, the CID, and the Fayetteville Police. They moved with a quiet, methodical purpose that I understood and respected. They treated my home with a grim reverence, a place where a crime had been committed, but also where a family had been shattered. They spoke to me not as a fragile victim, but as a fellow professional, Sergeant Taylor, whose observations were critical intel. The evidence mounted with crushing, undeniable force. In Evelyn's guest room, tucked away in a designer makeup bag, they found the nearly empty bottle of prescription sleeping pills. The toxicology reports from the autopsy came back, confirming what I already knew in my bones. Ethan and Elijah had fatal concentrations of zolpidem in their systems. The nail in her coffin came from an unlikely source, Noah's own paranoia. Months earlier, he had installed a small security camera in the living room, disguised as a smoke detector, supposedly to keep an eye on the kids. Evelyn, in her arrogance, had either forgotten or not known it was there. The CID Cybercrimes Unit recovered the deleted footage from the cloud. The video was grainy, shot in the ghostly green of night vision. But it was enough. It showed a shadowy figure, Evelyn's height, her build, creeping into the kitchen on 2 separate nights, opening the refrigerator and spending just a little too long preparing the bottles. The case was airtight. Noah, meanwhile, had completely imploded. Stripped of his mother's influence and forced to face the stark, ugly reality of his own complicity, he fell apart. The lead detective, a tired-looking man from Fayetteville PD, told me Noah hadn't just cried during his interrogation. He'd become incoherent, cycling through denial, rage at his mother, and a profound self-hatred. He kept saying, "I should have listened," the detective recounted, shaking his head. Over and over. "I should have listened to my wife." He understands his role in this. I'll give him that. A week after the funeral, he came to the small on-base apartment the Army had arranged for me and Lily. He looked like a ghost, his eyes hollowed out, his clothes rumpled. He didn't speak. He just fell to his knees in front of me on the generic government-issue carpet. "Tilly, I'm sorry," he whispered, the words fractured by tears. "Please, forgive me. I didn't know. I never would have." I looked down at the man I had once loved, the man whose promise of stability had been a siren song. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just a vast, cold emptiness. The part of me that had loved him had died with our sons. "My forgiveness can't bring Ethan and Elijah back, Noah," I said, my voice as flat and hard as packed earth. "I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. Get up. Your weakness killed my sons just as surely as her hands did." That was the last time I ever spoke to him as his wife. The trial at the Cumberland County Courthouse was a grim formality. Evelyn's high-priced lawyer tried to paint her as a confused, loving grandmother who'd made a tragic mistake with the dosage, claiming she only wanted to help the babies sleep better. But the prosecuting attorney, a sharp woman with an unshakable voice, didn't resort to theatrics. She simply laid out the evidence, brick by brick, building an inescapable prison of facts around Evelyn. She presented the toxicology reports as clinical certainties. She played the grainy security footage on a large screen for the jury to see, the ghostly green figure of Evelyn becoming a specter of calculated malice. She concluded with the damning testimony of Lily's child therapist, who relayed the story of the angel dust. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom was silent. I sat in the front row, flanked by Colonel Miller and my friend Maria. They weren't just my comrades, they were my honor guard, a silent, uniformed wall protecting me from the stares and whispers. "On the charge of 2 counts of first-degree murder," the foreman said, his voice steady, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Evelyn Richardson, guilty." A strangled sob erupted from Evelyn as she collapsed in her chair. A wave of relief and quiet murmurs washed over the courtroom. But I felt no joy, no triumph. As the judge handed down a sentence of life in prison without parole, I only felt the immense, crushing weight of what had been lost. Justice had been served, but my sons were still gone. The victory was hollow, a crater where a family used to be. The following week, I walked into the JAG office on post. The Judge Advocate General's Corps is the Army's legal arm, providing free counsel for soldiers. A sharp, no-nonsense captain with tired but kind eyes listened to my story. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts like a mission briefing, concise and chronological. He didn't interrupt, just nodded, his respect for my composure evident. My demands were simple. I filed for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. I didn't ask for alimony. I didn't fight over assets. I wanted only 2 things: sole, absolute legal and physical custody of Lily, and for the house, that monument to my broken dreams, to be sold immediately, the proceeds split however the court saw fit. I never wanted to set foot in it again. When the captain placed the divorce papers in front of me, my hand was steady. The pen felt heavy, not with hesitation, but with the finality of a life I was now closing the door on. As I signed my name, Tilly Taylor, on the dotted line, I wasn't just ending a marriage. I was formally acknowledging a painful truth. The family I had so desperately wanted, the one I had compromised my own instincts to protect, had never been real. It was a toxic mirage. And with one final decisive stroke of the pen, I was walking. The stroke of the pen that signed away my marriage was a quiet, legal severing. The days that followed were the physical manifestation of that act, a loud, messy exorcism of a life that was no longer mine. I stood in the middle of the living room of the Haymount house, surrounded by a sea of cardboard boxes and packing tape. Each object I touched was a ghost, a memory I had to decide whether to keep or banish. This wasn't just moving out, it was a ritual of reclaiming my own soul. I started with her things. The plush, overstuffed armchair she always sat in, the one she'd claimed was more supportive for her back, was the first to go. I didn't sell it. I dragged it to the curb with a free sign taped to it, a satisfying thud echoing its finality. The gaudy floral curtains she'd insisted would brighten the place up were torn down from the rods, the sound of ripping fabric like a small scream of liberation. I packed them in a black trash bag. Every item she had brought into this house, every subtle mark of her occupation, was systematically purged. Then I came to the wedding album. It lay on the coffee table, a heavy leather-bound book of lies. I opened it, my hands steady. There we were, me, young and naive, blinded by the desperate hope for a family. Noah, smiling, already a shadow of the man he could have been. I didn't cry. I felt a profound, surgical detachment. I carefully removed every picture that contained just me or me with Lily. Then, without a moment's hesitation, I took the thick, heavy book with all its remaining glossy memories of Noah and Evelyn and dropped it into a cardboard box filled with trash. I was taking back control of my own story, editing out the characters who had tried to destroy the protagonist. The final test of that control came a few weeks later, just before Evelyn's appeal hearing was scheduled. The doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole, and my stomach tightened. It was Noah. He looked 10 years older, his face gaunt, his eyes pleading. I opened the door just a crack. "Tilly, please," he began, his voice raspy. I need you to write a letter to the judge, for my mother's appeal. Just to say, she wasn't in her right mind. That she's just a sick old woman who needs help." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the full, pathetic scope of his weakness. Even after everything, after the truth had been laid bare in a court of law, he was still trying to find a way to recast his mother as a victim. My voice, when it came, was devoid of any emotion. It was as calm and unwavering as a drill sergeant's command. "She's not insane, Noah. She's evil. And your blindness, your desperate need to believe she was a saint, is what gave that evil its power. Don't you ever come to me for her again." I didn't wait for a response. I closed the door firmly in his face, the click of the deadbolt locking into place serving as the final, definitive punctuation mark on our shared history. It was a painful, brutal act of severance, but as I leaned against the door, I felt not triumph, but the quiet, aching relief of a wound being cauterized. In the lonely weeks that followed, the silence of the new, smaller apartment became deafening. The adrenaline of the trial was gone, replaced by a lingering exhaustion. That's when Maria, my friend from the unit, intervened. "You can't do this alone, Taylor," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She told me about a support group. "It's for Gold Star mothers," she explained gently. My heart recoiled. "I'm not one of them," I said quietly. "My sons didn't die in combat." Maria looked at me, her eyes filled with a fierce understanding. "You were in a war, Tilly. And you lost your children in the line of fire. You belong." I went. The meeting was in a quiet room at the community center on post. I sat in a circle with a handful of women whose faces held a familiar, profound grief. They were mothers of soldiers lost in Iraq, Afghanistan, training accidents. They didn't offer platitudes or ask invasive questions. One woman simply handed me a steaming mug of coffee. Another, seeing my hands tremble, just nodded. They talked, sharing stories not of death, but of life, of their sons' terrible jokes, their favorite foods, the way they used to leave their size 12 boots in the middle of the hallway. For the first time since the tragedy, I wasn't Sergeant Taylor, the strong one. I wasn't the victim from the headlines. I was just a mother who had lost her children, sitting with other mothers who understood that unique, permanent amputation of the soul. In their quiet, powerful presence, I was finally allowed to be weak. I had found my chosen family. That night, I started reading a book one of the mothers had mentioned, Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. I read about how vulnerability isn't weakness and how setting boundaries is the most courageous act of self-love. The words resonated deep within me, giving a name and a framework to the battle I was fighting. Later, as I was tucking Lily into bed, her little face serious in the soft glow of her nightlight, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Mommy, are we never going to see Grandma Evelyn again?" I took a deep breath, the words from the book echoing in my mind. I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, my voice gentle but firm. "That's right, sweetie. We're not." "Why?" "Because," I said, choosing my words with care, "some people, even people in our family, aren't safe for us to be around. They hurt us. And my most important job, more important than being a soldier, is to keep you safe." I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I promise you, from now on, I will always keep you safe." That promise wasn't just for her. It was a vow I was making to myself. It was the sound of a new boundary being drawn, not in anger, but in love. It was the first day of my own reconstruction. A promise to a child is a defensive line, a boundary drawn in the sand to keep the monsters out. But in the quiet months that followed, as Lily and I settled into our new, smaller, safer life, I began to understand that defense wasn't enough. To truly honor my sons, to give their short lives a meaning that transcended the tragedy, I couldn't just hold the line, I had to go on the attack. The question was, how? After the whirlwind of the investigation and the trial, I was left in a quiet, unnerving stillness. I had to face a crossroads that terrified me more than any combat jump. What was next for Sergeant Taylor? Should I leave the Army, take the benefits I'd earned, and disappear into a quiet civilian life with Lily? Or should I stay in the only world I'd ever truly known? One morning, I stood in front of the mirror, putting on my uniform for the day. I looked at the decorations on my chest, the ribbons and badges I'd earned through sweat and perseverance. And then my eyes fell on my parachutist badge, the silver jump wings that had once been the ultimate symbol of my pride and identity. Now, they felt hollow, almost meaningless. The Army had taught me how to fight enemies on foreign soil, how to be resilient, how to lead. But its structures and systems had offered no protection from the enemy inside my own home. I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness, a soldier without a clear mission. The feeling lingered until I was required to attend a division-wide town hall at the main post theater. I sat in the back, expecting another dry briefing on readiness and regulations. But the division's commanding general, a 2-star with a reputation for being a thinker, not just a fighter, stepped up to the podium. He didn't talk about war. He talked about service. "Every soldier in this room has a primary mission," he said, his voice resonating through the auditorium. "But your greatest purpose might be found beyond that. The Army isn't just an institution, it's a community. And a community is only as strong as its most vulnerable members." He scanned the faces in the crowd. "I'm asking you to look at your experiences, all of them. Look at your training, your deployments, and yes, look at your scars. Use those scars. Turn them into your expertise. Use them to make this Army stronger, safer, and more human for the soldier standing next to you." His words didn't just strike a chord, they were a lightning strike that jolted my entire being. It was a direct order from the universe. My scars weren't a source of shame or a sign of failure. They were my qualifications. I didn't have to leave the Army to find a new purpose. I could fight a new kind of war, right here. That night, my apartment was lit by the blue glow of my laptop screen. I didn't scroll through social media or watch TV. I researched. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in search terms with a renewed sense of urgency. Army JAG Corps. Enlisted to officer programs. Military family law. Child protection policies. I fell down a rabbit hole of articles, regulations, and personal accounts from military lawyers. A fire, one I thought had been extinguished forever, began to smolder, then catch, then burn brightly within me. I could be the person I had so desperately needed. I could be the one who listened to a soldier's fears and didn't dismiss them as overreacting. I could be the one who understood the unique pressures of military life and how they could be exploited by abusers. I could be a lawyer, a protector, a voice for the silent victims trapped in domestic wars behind the closed doors of base housing. My pain was no longer a burden. It had been transformed into my sharpest weapon, my most valuable credential. The next morning, I walked into my company headquarters, my back straight, my steps sure. I requested a formal meeting with my commanding officer, Colonel Miller. He saw me immediately. In his office, I didn't ramble or show emotion. I stood at parade rest and laid out my plan as if I were briefing a mission. "Sir, I've decided on my next career path," I began. "I intend to complete my bachelor's degree. Following that, I will apply to law school through the Army's funded legal education program. My goal is to earn a commission and serve in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, specializing in family and victim advocacy." Colonel Miller, the man who had seen me at my absolute lowest, listened without interruption. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, his eyes never leaving mine. He had seen my story unfold, from the whispers in the chapel to the verdict in the courtroom. When I finished, a slow, deep expression of profound respect settled on his face. "Sergeant Taylor," he said, his voice filled with a sincere gravity I had rarely heard. "Some people join the JAG Corps because it's a good career. You'd be joining because it's a calling." He stood up and extended his hand. "The Army would be lucky to have you. You do it. My office will give you whatever support you need." As I shook his firm, steady hand, I felt a sense of validation that had nothing to do with medals or promotions. It was the recognition I had been searching for all my life. Not as a wife, not as a daughter-in-law, but as myself. A soldier with a new mission. A paratrooper, ready for the next jump into a future I would build myself. 10 years. A decade is long enough to forge a sergeant into a captain, a victim into an advocate. It's long enough for a 4-year-old girl to become a teenager with opinions on everything from music to curfew. And it's long enough to turn the raw, ragged edges of grief into the polished, solid foundation of purpose. I stood in a cold, windowless conference room deep within the maze of the Pentagon. The air was thick with the scent of institutional coffee and the quiet hum of immense power. I was Captain Tilly Taylor now, a lawyer in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps, my dress blues tailored and sharp, the silver oak leaf of my rank gleaming on my shoulders. Across the polished mahogany table sat a committee of generals and senior civilian officials, their faces impassive, their careers built on budgets, logistics, and the hard calculus of risk assessment. I was no longer the young paratrooper fighting for my own sanity. I was an officer, a seasoned attorney, presenting a policy proposal I had spent the better part of 3 years building. My voice was steady, my words precise, filled with the weight of my own unspoken experience. "Generals, sirs, ma'am," I began, my gaze meeting each of theirs in turn. "We are here today to discuss a critical vulnerability in our force readiness. It's not a gap in our armor or a flaw in our weaponry. It's the enemy that follows our soldiers home." I didn't just quote statutes and regulations. I told stories. They were composites, anonymized accounts drawn from the dozens of cases I had handled, the whispered confessions I had heard in my office. I spoke of a young Marine, a decorated marksman, whose performance in the field plummeted because he was terrified his wife's new boyfriend was abusing his son back at Camp Lejeune. I spoke of a brilliant female intelligence analyst who was being systematically gaslit by her husband, a man who convinced her she was unstable, driving her to the brink of a breakdown and jeopardizing national security. I was fighting a new kind of war, a war waged on paper and in policy meetings. The journey to this room had been a relentless grind. I'd faced the institutional inertia, the bureaucratic red tape that is the military's natural defense against change. I'd encountered colonels who believed with all their heart that a soldier's family is a private matter. I'd been told my proposals were too expensive, too complex, too invasive. But I had my paratrooper training to fall back on. I gathered my intelligence, the data linking domestic instability to decreased mission effectiveness. I built my alliances, finding sympathetic ears in the medical corps and among the chaplains. And I presented my operational plan with relentless, unyielding logic. A soldier cannot be effective downrange if they are fighting a psychological war at home, I argued, my voice ringing with the conviction of a survivor. The health of our military families is not a soft issue. It is a direct and measurable component of our strength as a fighting force. My proposal was comprehensive. It called for mandatory, confidential mental health screenings, not just for service members, but for their spouses and dependents upon arrival at a new duty station. It established secure, anonymous reporting channels for psychological abuse and coercive control, forms of harm that leave no visible bruises. Most importantly, it mandated advanced training for family advocacy program workers and command teams to recognize the subtle, insidious signs of manipulation before they escalated into tragedy. After my presentation, the questions came, sharp and skeptical. But for every challenge, I had a data point. For every objection, I had a counter-argument. And for every dismissal of the problem, I had the unspoken story of my own 2 sons. Months passed. The proposal went through revisions, committees, and endless reviews. Finally, the day came. An official memorandum was published, announcing the approval of a new, service-wide policy. It contained everything I had fought for. The policy had a dry, official title: Department of Defense Directive 6400.09. But that's not what the soldiers called it. Within the ranks, passed along in conversations and emails, it was given another name. They called it the Ethan and Elijah Initiative. The first time I heard it, spoken by a young sergeant I was helping with a custody case, the sound hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had to excuse myself, walking into the hallway and leaning against the cold wall, my eyes shut tight. The grief was still there, a permanent resident in my soul. But for the first time, it was joined by something else. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace. My boys' deaths were no longer a silent, private tragedy. Their names, which I had whispered into the darkness for 10 years, were now a symbol of hope and protection for thousands of military families. Their legacy was not of victimhood, but of sanctuary. My love for them had become immortal. One afternoon, a letter with a prison postmark arrived at my office. I recognized Noah's handwriting instantly. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. But curiosity, or perhaps the need for a final, definitive closure, made me open it. He wrote that he had spent 10 years in therapy, forced to confront the man he had been. He didn't ask for my forgiveness. He said he knew he didn't deserve it. He just wanted me to know that he had followed my career from a distance. He'd read about the new policy. "What you did, Tilly," he wrote, "that initiative. It's the only good thing that came from all that horror. You built a monument to them. I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you." I read the letter once, then a second time. I felt no anger, no sadness, only a distant, quiet peace. He was a ghost from another life, a man I no longer knew. The chapter was over. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I never answered it. The story ends, as it so often does, on a quiet Saturday morning at Fort Liberty. The North Carolina sun streams onto the porch of my new, smaller house, a place filled not with shadows, but with light and the lingering scent of fresh coffee. I sat in a simple rocking chair, my running shoes propped up on the railing, the warmth of a ceramic mug seeping into my hands. This was my peace, hard-won and fiercely protected. The sound of a very serious negotiation drifted through the screen door. "But Mom, everyone is going," Lily said, her voice laced with the dramatic flair only a 14-year-old can master. "It's a rite of passage. You can't deny me a rite of passage." I took a slow sip of my coffee, hiding a smile. A rite of passage, huh? Last week, getting your own phone was a rite of passage. This week, it's a concert on a school night for a band whose lead singer looks like he needs a good meal and a shower. "He's an artist. It's an aesthetic," she groaned. "I'll do the dishes for a month. I'll walk the dog you keep saying we should get. I'll even pretend to like your boring legal dramas." It was a perfectly normal, wonderfully mundane argument. It was about trust and boundaries, about curfews, and the delicate dance of a teenager pushing for independence and a mother holding the line. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world. The sheer, precious normality of it was a luxury I would never again take for granted. "You can do the dishes for a month anyway," I called back, "and you can go. But your curfew is 11 o'clock sharp, and I want a text when you get there and when you're leaving. Deal?" A shriek of pure joy erupted from inside, followed by the sound of her running up the stairs, presumably to coordinate outfits with her friends via 100 text messages. She had won. I smiled, leaning my head back against the chair. My gaze drifted upward, past the tall pine trees, to the vast Carolina blue sky. And there they were. High above, a flight of C-17s had just released their cargo. A constellation of green parachutes blossomed against the blue, the men and women of the 82nd Airborne beginning their descent. 10 years ago, the sight of those jump wings on my uniform felt like a mockery. Years later, looking at those same parachutes felt like looking at a ghost. But today, watching them float silently toward the earth, I felt something new. I felt a sense of belonging, of peace. A full circle. The Army wasn't the thing that had destroyed my family. It was the thing that had given me the discipline to survive its destruction. It was the foundation I had used to rebuild, brick by painful brick. Tucked inside my wallet, right next to my military ID card, is a small, worn photograph of Ethan and Elijah. It's a picture from the hospital, their tiny faces peaceful, their futures unwritten. I don't look at it every day. I don't need to. They are not a constant sorrow that weighs me down. They are my moral compass. They are the silent, steady reminder of why I do what I do, of the promise I made to Lily and to myself. Their legacy isn't just a dry policy document filed away in the Pentagon. It's in the relieved face of a young soldier I helped secure a protective order for. It's in the child who gets to sleep safely at night because we intervened. They are present in every family I help, every child I protect. I'm often asked to speak to young military families now to share my story. They ask me how I survived, how I found the strength to go on. I don't have an easy answer. I don't quote regulations or psychology textbooks. I usually end with a simple passage I found long ago from the Psalms. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." But it's not a passive hope. The morning doesn't just arrive. You have to fight your way through the darkness to get there. My name is Captain Tilly Taylor. I am a lawyer, I am a mother, and I am still a paratrooper. The scars from my past never disappeared. They didn't magically heal or fade away. Instead, they became a part of my uniform, stitched into the fabric of who I am. They are not a sign of damage. They are a map of my survival. They remind me that even when you are in a free fall, tumbling through the darkness with no ground in sight, there is always a moment of choice. A moment you have to reach out, find the handle, and pull the cord. You have to choose to open your parachute. You have to trust that the long night will end. And you have to understand that the dawn will come, because you are the one who is creating it for yourself. My story has found its dawn, but I know it's just one of many. Thank you for being a part of my journey from the darkest night to this peaceful morning. This channel exists to share stories like ours, stories of resilience, of finding strength in our scars, and of turning pain into purpose. If my voice has resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of these stories, please follow our channel so we can continue this mission together. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. You have the power to create your own dawn.